Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. So I'll be, again, I'm Jamie Azios down in Texas, Southern United States, talking a little bit about a minimally guided online program that we developed called Conversation Connection. So let's just start off kind of talking about why is it important for us to focus on the partner. Travis Threats has said that spouses of people with aphasia can be referred to as hidden victims of aphasia. We know aphasia is one of those third-party disabilities that really affects not just the person with aphasia, but also everybody within that family unit. And now from the late 90s on, we've had several studies that show us that there are psychological and social consequences of aphasia for the partner. We see increased risk of depression. We see social isolation, especially on those outer perimeter social circles, like with friends. We see the social networks kind of shrinking. So we know the partner is a valuable focus of our intervention. And of course, we have a few systematic reviews that tell us that communication partner training is highly effective and that it works. And now we know that it's a top 10 best practice recommendations for aphasia. So we know this is really something we need to be thinking about and implementing into our treatment as clinicians. We also know a lot about conversational activities between partners and people with aphasia. And from some great work that's done in conversation analysis from Suzanne Beek and some of her colleagues, and also Guillaume Ledours and Claire Coteau have done some great work in Canada that has showed us there's some behaviors that partners of people with aphasia do that are very helpful, but there's also some behaviors in conversation that might detract from engagement in conversation for the person with aphasia. A good example of that is the work on overprotection or speaking for behaviors that we know partners can do in a way of thinking that it's helpful, but that actually inhibits the person with aphasia from engaging in conversation. And from a more broader standpoint, we know that as we've moved from a medical model to more of a social model of disability, we understand that disability is not a construct that's based on the impairment in just a person with aphasia. We know that there are external influences that impact the amount of disability a person with aphasia might face. Those are seen as social barriers. For instance, barriers in the environment. Maybe a building isn't as accessible because they don't have aphasia-friendly signage in it. Or maybe a person with aphasia experiences people in the community that have negative attitudes about aphasia. Or stereotypes about a person with aphasia. We've all heard these stories as clinicians, right? Those can increase the amount of disability a person with aphasia feels. We also know that organizations themselves have barriers that create disability. There's some great work. Deborah Hurst did some good work that looks at ward talk. And I believe it's an inpatient rehab that talks about some of the institutional practices that inhibit people with aphasia from really engaging in any communication participation in those spaces. So we know that the idea of disability moves beyond just the person with an impairment. And also the AFROM put out by Ora Kagan and Nina Simmons-Mackey has also increased our attention to what it means to live with aphasia. And what maybe domains of treatments or domains or frameworks or treatments might fit into. And the language impairment itself is only one domain, and communication partner training really would encompass the domains of both the communication and language environment and participation in life situations, which are so important for us to focus on if we want to move people with aphasia forward and decrease the amount of disability that they have. But there's a different question about what we should be doing and what we are doing. And as many of you know, there's a big evidence practice gap in our field. This is especially happening in acute care. Abby Foster has talked about acute care SLPs feeling disempowered, feeling that they can't apply evidence to practice in that setting. We know that from some recent work by Emily Brogan and some of her colleagues in Australia, that what we would consider usual care in aphasia treatment is mostly single word naming types of tasks. From a more positive standpoint, there was a study in Australia that looked at surveys of speech language pathologists, and they did report that they implemented communication partner training across some rehab settings, mostly inpatient rehab and outpatient. But here in the United States, as we know from the white paper written by Nina Simmons-Mackey, there's a systemic failure to provide a holistic approach to address life participation here. And so this is kind of a big gap that we're trying to fill. Is there's lots of barriers to implementing these types of approaches like communication partner training in actual clinical practice. But perhaps the biggest barrier that we face is a limitation in time and also a limitation in funding. So as we know as clinicians, we get very little time in our reimbursement here in the US with people with aphasia, about 2 hours average, one study found in inpatient, acute, or outpatient. And then as we move beyond the subacute phase to chronic phase, there's very limited funding to get people the therapy that they need. So we often run out of time to address things like the partner in our face-to-face treatment sessions. And just from a clinical anecdotal standpoint, partners are often overwhelmed. And so when they bring a person with aphasia to therapy, if they're the sole caregiver and are responsible for many of those caretaking activities, they often view that therapy time as respite time. And so it's very difficult for them to be in the therapy room and being involved whenever they really do need a little bit of a break and some respite time there. And so as we thought about some of these barriers, an immediate kind of solution that we have right now is to look at other options for therapies and maybe rethink what technology brings to the table. And so that really prompted us to think about conversation partner training from an online standpoint as an adjunct to face-to-face intervention, not as a replacement for face-to-face intervention. And the cool thing about us trying to do this work now is that we've got really good models for this already. There's a great program called Better Conversations with Aphasia in the UK, put out by Suzanne Beek, and then there's some studies on it by Best and colleagues that show some promise. And also Ora Kagan's work with looking at partner training for healthcare professionals and volunteers. There's some online-based programs there. But here in the US, this area is really lacking. So there really aren't many resources that exist, and those that do exist really haven't been comprehensively studied. And so we looked at developing a program that we called Conversation Connection. We used an e-platform that had both an app and also a learning management system, which is kind of like a Blackboard or Moodle or Canvas. And so participants could access the program either way. This is what the app-based program looked like. This is the dashboard, and you could click on the learning to access the different modules. And just briefly, I'd like to tell you what the modules are about. There were 4 modules in the program. The first program was about understanding stroke and aphasia. So this was really more knowledge and education about what stroke is, what are warning signs in case someone had another stroke, what is aphasia. And we embedded lots of videos from caregivers into our program because we thought that was very important for partners to not hear our perspective, but hear the perspective of partners of people with aphasia. And I'd like to just play an example of what this video looked like in Module 1.
I never knew what aphasia was. I never had been around anyone that had a stroke. I just had heard, that it was debilitating, but never really had personal experience of being around anyone that has it. And
I never knew what aphasia was. I thought it was just all one thing, it's a stroke. She didn't have no idea what it was until after she started reading on it. And when the, people, uh, medical people began to explain to her what some parts of it was, and we began to uh, get more knowledge of it and begin to read more of it and everything. So we began to seek out for other helps.
Oops, sorry there. So that's an example of like a video that would be in the first module. There's also lots of text information and things like that embedded all the modules. The second module was really about how to improve access to communication. So we used the word communication access in that phrase and kind of talked about barriers that could happen there in this module, and then some strategies to overcome those barriers. So we worked through things like showing what keywording was and how to use that, and had several videos of that. We also brought up like organizational barriers, like what happens when you go to the doctor, or, and you have paperwork that's not aphasia friendly. And we gave some examples of how spouses might be able to help create aphasia friendly small things, materials for a person with aphasia, like labels on medication and things like that. The third module, we really delved deep into what is conversation. And so this was, again, a lot based on the face-to-face studies that we have with Spark, and what seems to work for people, for partners, whenever they're learning about conversation. So we might talk about what conversation is, show some videos of people with aphasia conversing with their partners, and point out different behaviors or strategies, and then ask them to reflect on that. And then the fourth module was really all about how the caregiver could gain support. And so we talked about how the role as a caregiver might change from the beginning stages of recovery to later. We tried not to neglect important areas like intimacy, and we added information about those kinds of things that are typically not available in these kinds of resources.
you have to have a lot of...
I'm a little short on time, so I think I'm gonna go through that video, but that was another video of partners talking about their experiences caregiving. So we did a study that looked at the feasibility and usability of the program. We had 4 people with aphasia and 6 experts in aphasia go through the program. We collected focus group data from the significant others, and then we also collected written feedback, which was embedded throughout the program. And at the end, there is a research intervention satisfaction survey that we embedded into the program that all the participants took. And so today I'll talk just a little bit about our findings from the focus group and written feedback, and show you some descriptive data for the intervention satisfaction survey. We did find good feasibility and usability. We coded these using existing feasibility and usability frameworks. We all know it's very important when you're designing an intervention to get feasibility data on the intervention. And if you're designing an internet-based intervention, it's very important to find out how usable the program was. And I think it was Abby Roper that talked a little bit about that this morning, about why this is important for technology. All of our participants that were spouses were in their 70s or 80s. And so fortunately, in terms of usability, if you look at the intervention satisfaction survey here at the bottom, they actually rated the platform as more usable than the experts, which was good to know. This was just a Likert scale, and 4 was agree and 5 was strongly agree. And so that was good news. They talked about both all the effectiveness, the efficiency, and satisfaction that they had with the program and the platform itself. And in terms of feasibility, we had really good data to support acceptability constructs, demand constructs, and appropriateness constructs. And so that quote that I have in the beginning of "It made me feel more hopeful" is a quote that we took from that focus group data, where a spouse was talking about how when her husband first was diagnosed with a stroke, the physicians at the hospital told her that there was no hope. After 6 months, he wouldn't progress, so whatever he would be at 6 months was what he would be. He had a pretty severe posterior lesion, and so he has a pretty severe fluent type of aphasia. And so when she went through the program, she just said, it made me feel more hopeful that myth was kind of debunked in the program, that you talked about that in the first module. So that was very encouraging to hear that story. Another quote that I'll highlight in terms of acceptability is, we've been married for forever and I'm supposed to have all these memories, but if I'd had something like this to begin with, it would have saved me some of the frustration, us bickering at each other. And that comes from a spouse who's the person with aphasia that she's married to has been diagnosed now for 10 years. And she still found benefit out of the program. So I thought that was good. We had some challenges. There, in terms of feasibility, it was pretty good, but in terms of usability, there were some issues with the e-platform in terms of like logging on and password, having to change your password multiple times. When they would log back onto the program, it would kick them back to a place that they had already visited, and so they would be wasting time because they had already been through that material. The other thing that was raised in the focus group was, and this is a feasibility construct, is how can the program be adapted? And all the spouses talked about this idea that when they were first had their experiences in the hospital, it was very much of an overload of information. So that might not be the best time to go through a program like this. It might be good to introduce this program at that stage, but then they could have it later to revisit later on. So that made me really think about the value of something like an online-based program that was accessible throughout the recovery period, that people could go back to and get different kinds of information as they went through this journey. So that kind of made me rethink about how this program might be used. We had a question as to whether the program should be minimally guided versus self-guided. I think that's going to depend on the level of competence of the user in terms of technology, but also we need to think a little bit more about if a partner does have questions as they go through this program and they're not seeing an SLP, how can we connect them with an SLP, a professional that can maybe answer some of their questions? And so we haven't really worked that out yet. We're still thinking about those kinds of things. And then the biggest challenge was that the e-platform company that we used completely went under after we ran the feasibility study. And so we didn't have access to the app-based software and the ability to collect private data that's protected through the program. And so that's our biggest challenge that we're trying to face going forward. So speaking of going forward, where do we go from here? Well, right now we're making changes based on our current data. What we really need to do is get our current version up on a learning management system, and which we could probably do low cost to no cost, and get that into the hands of users for pilot testing. So what we really need to do is identify some partnerships with clinicians who are out there in the trenches who think this might be beneficial. and see if they would be agreeable or think it would be useful to recommend as an adjunct to the therapy that they're providing. We need to make some partnerships with other researchers, especially in other disciplines like computer science and software engineering, who may have some better answers for us in terms of usability, and also just have some solutions we hadn't thought about yet as clinicians and researchers. The other thing I've really thought about lately is the power of getting information in this medium and being able to revisit it, and what that means for other types of partners. So I'm very interested in the interactions that happen in long-term care. And so I'm thinking more about how could this medium be used for training of nurses and nurse aides or volunteers into nursing homes. I'm also thinking about partners that are on the periphery, some work that we're doing looking at friendships in aphasia. Could this be something that could supplement a face-to-face intervention with those groups as well? And then, of course, to do these kinds of things, you really need to, and to move it forward in the way it needs to, we need to be able to seek out some funding sources, because e-platforms are really expensive. And they take a lot of power to run. And so that's one thing that we're looking at right now, is identifying some funding sources for this kind of work to get it out there. So I think I saved time for maybe a question or two.
Hi, Jamie.
Hey.
So I'm going to go with Todd's standard question here.
Oh gosh.
Nugget would you take from this?
So what's the big idea? What do I want people to think about?
Yeah. What is, if you could pick one part of it, what would you specifically want as your little nugget of information?
Well, I think, previously when I thought about internet-based interventions, I was very negative about them and just very worried about what that meant. And through this process, I've learned about what place they may have in our field and how they might be utilized both as an adjunct and then sometimes in replacement. We're learning that with COVID a lot now. So I think it's just more of an idea of like opening our eyes to the possibilities and the needs of people, and making things more accessible and affordable for people with aphasia and their partners.